Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Shelley Blackwell again from Kansas, and she is an MTSS Literacy Support Specialist.
Yeah,
Ooh.
it's a long title.
Yeah, well, so in the last episode, we talked about your story to how you got to this role. But do you want to give listeners just a quick, the elevator speech of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I spent 22 years as a school-based speech pathologist. Prior to that, I worked in a literacy clinic and I had learned Linda Mood Bell, so I was familiar with that. Then between that and graduating from my master's, I worked with a woman who had written a curriculum for elementary school teachers in the late 90s. And we did teacher training and coaching and modeling of lessons and things in the classroom. So my entire career has been based in literacy. As a speech pathologist, I did a lot of work with literacy intervention and remediation. Part of my doctorate work was to focus on dyslexia and professional learning. One of the things that I didn't say in our previous conversation was that as an SLP, there really isn't a lot of materials out there for us to use in the clinical setting. And so part of my doctorate work was to develop orthography and morphology lessons and scope and sequence and kind of a curriculum that was evidence-based, but that SLPs could just pick up and use in the SLP school setting. So that's been my work. My focus is on just helping kids learn how to read, helping teachers learn how to teach them.
Wonderful. That's an amazing role. And I think the educators in your district and the students in your district are so lucky to have you, because you are able to not only reach students on a one-on-one basis, but you're able to help support teachers in the classroom learn how to implement the science of reading curriculum that may be different from their initial training. And they can watch you in their classroom with their students and see the changes.
Yeah, I think that's a key point of what makes successful or support successful. Is it's one thing to go to a training and hear about it and think, oh, okay, well, that's great, but how does that fit in with my kids? And so being available in my job to go in and model a lesson or pull a student and give a second opinion of here's what I see when I listen to this student read, or go through daily work samples with teachers, getting to actually go through that process with their students, with the support from that I can give them and my team members too, is I think a really critical piece to the growth and success that we've been having.
Of course. Now, why don't we start out by defining what MTSS is and why it provides that dynamic response to students' needs?
Right. So on Kansas, at least, MTSS has been around for a while, but I don't think it's really been understood until recently. So MTSS as a concept means multi-tiered system of supports. And so really, essentially, it's a framework for best practice. So tier one, we think about as core instruction. This is what the teacher teaches all day, every day. Every student gets to be a part of that. I love Dr. Anita Archer's phrase of every student, everything. And so even if you've got students in your classroom that have learning disabilities or cognitive delays or behavior issues, or they're EL, English language learners, they still have a right to participate in tier one. They deserve to be part of tier one and that core instruction at that grade level. That's not to say that a teacher may need to alter something to best meet their learning rate, but just because they aren't at grade level doesn't mean that they can't participate in grade level content. They can sit and listen. They can be a part of discussion. And what makes me think especially about that is comprehension. And a lot of teachers will say, well, they're a fifth grader reading at a third grade level. They can't participate in this comprehension group or in this book study. I'm like, actually they can. You may have to read it to them, but they can talk about vocabulary. They can talk about inferencing, and they can talk about what their perspectives are and their interpretations are. They just can't read the text. So let's read it for them while they develop those language skills.
Well, and it's essential that they take part of those lessons, because how else are they going to have the exposure to the content and the vocabulary if they can't access it on their own?
Exactly. In the work that we've been doing in my district, we've really brought in Scarborough's rope and simple view of reading, to the point where some of my teachers, I'll pull out Scarborough's rope and they're like, oh, not again. But what's been great, and actually I said to them, as we look at Scarborough's rope, this is how you decide what you're going to teach and how you're going to teach it. And so one of the analogies I give is that the bottom part of the rope is like a map. It tells us step by step how to get from A to B. The top part of our rope is more like a compass, where we have a direction, but we have lots of different ways to get there. And so knowing where in your instruction you have some flexibility and where in your instruction it has to be very systematic and explicit can really help us in deciding what we're going to do in our instruction. So for instance, we were talking about morphology, and we have some curriculum that they can use. And she's like, I use this instead. Can I use this instead? Which is when I pulled out my Scarborough's rope and I said, well, that's the top part of the rope. So this is your compass. You have to hit your standards. You have to address, these parts of that of morphology, vocabulary, context clues. Those are the standards that we weave in. So if you can do those things with product A and product B, then you choose. But if we were talking about the bottom part of the rope, our phonics instruction, for instance, no, you can't do what you want to do. We've got to follow exactly the script and the structure that our district's laid out, because it requires explicit systematic instruction. So side note on Scarborough's rope, but back to the simple view, because they have now understood that there are two pieces that contribute to reading comprehension. We have our word recognition piece, and we also have our language comprehension. Just because the kids can't recognize words doesn't mean we halt their language comprehension development. We still have to fill this bucket while we're filling this other bucket. So when they can read the words, they've got something to access. They've got background knowledge and vocabulary. So it's essential that for students who cannot read the text, teachers are still imparting all of that language and working on that comprehension, building vocabulary, building background knowledge, building critical thinking, so that when they can read the text, they're ready to go.
Definitely. And so there's whole group or whole class instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And then tier 2 takes us to small group instruction.
I want to back up a second, because on tier 1, we can also look at some differentiated small groups that's a little different than tier 2. And I feel like sometimes our teachers get caught up in which tier am I in, which tier, which step. And as we start to think about this whole process, this framework, it's more of a continuum where tier 1 goes across all aspects of it. Usually we see the pyramid of the tier 1, tier 2, and we go up the pyramid. Well, the Department of Education in Michigan has this great graphic that's a horizontal continuum. Mm-hmm. And tier 1 goes the entire length, no matter if you're in tier 2 or tier 3. Everybody gets tier 1. And then between those tiers, you see arrows. So it's very fluid. And so once we start to kind of educate teachers about how it's not a stepping stone to special education, it's a stepping stone in response to what that student needs. And we may go back and forth a couple times a year. So before we maybe go to tier 2, that differentiated small instruction could be, I'm going to use math for an example, because I do words, not numbers. And so I did well in math, but it was harder. And so there were units or chapters that I was like, or even a lesson, I'm like, I do not get this. I don't get this. Well, that doesn't mean I need an intervention. It means I might need a quick reteach, and that might be a one and done. And so that's where we might use our small group, our differentiated small group at tier 1, which I think teachers probably would go, yeah, I do that anyway. I do that. Well, do you know you're doing differentiated small group? But the difference between that and that support and the support at a tier 2 would be that tier 2 is going to be a little bit longer intervention. It's going to be strategic. And so when I observe my students in tier 1, I may do a little reteach for them, and I notice, you know what, they're not getting this. And this has been happening over several data points. They're struggling with this. That's going to maybe make me say, okay, I need to look a little deeper. I need to do a diagnostic. So in the literacy world, we're going to look and see, is there a phonics problem? So we're going to give a phonics screener and find that specific skill that's holding them up. And then our tier 2 intervention really addresses that skill. We do interventions on 3-week cycles so that we can see some students just need that intensive strategic intervention and go, oh, I got that, I'm good. And then they're back to tier 1. But if we kept them in an intervention for 6 to 8 weeks, we may be using a lot of their time that they don't need to have that intervention. So keeping it shorter is good to consider based on the intervention and the student, because we can kind of work through their progress a little quicker. But in that tier 2, this is where we have a small group. We have, I think they say 6 to 8 opportunities to respond per minute. My prompting and my corrective feedback is going to be like, oh, wait, what's that word? Have them look at it again. It's not going to be as direct as it would be in that tier 3. Right now, I'm just at tier 2, I'm just focusing in on that one. I'm laser-like focus. Maybe you could think of it kind of like a booster shot. So it's just something to kind of get them through. We do progress monitoring, and the progress monitoring is what tells us, hey, we've mastered this, and so you don't need this anymore. You're back at tier 1, only getting tier 1, not tier 1 and tier 2. If they don't master it, I can see, are you making growth? You may not have maybe you're not 10 out of 10, but you were 3 out of 10, and now you're 6 out of 10. So that growth would tell me this intervention is working. I need to give it a little bit more time. So we might do another cycle. So that's where tier 2 is. You have a small group. Sometimes, depending upon your district and needs and support, could be 3 days a week, could be 5 days a week for shorter sessions. It really varies upon your LEA, your local education agency. So that's kind of tier 2, right? So you're just upping the ante a little bit. Maybe instead of booster shot, it's that shot of espresso at the end of the day. Maybe you need to just push
That
through
cup of coffee you need to get through. And I
Yeah.
love how you're doing it in a very dynamic way so that there is movement and we can respond to the changing needs of the classroom based on the content that is being covered. With reading and literacy, it's a little more constant, but with things related to mathematics and other areas, that's where that dynamic nature comes into play. Especially, some kids have a really hard time with geometry, but have no problem with their quantitative concepts, right? Or their numeracy skills. So, for maybe 3/4 of the year, they're totally fine in tier 1, but during that geometry section, they need that extra bump up to tier 2 to get the intervention.
Yeah. And it's possible that you have a student who is getting tier 3 in math and tier 2 in literacy, or vice versa. And, one of the things that I kind of makes my skin crawl when I hear is when people say, well, these are my tier 2 kids, or these are my SPED kids, or my behavior kids. And really, they're just kids. To label them with that need, especially with the MTSS piece, everybody's an MTSS kid because everybody's in some tier. It just depends and is dynamic, like you said, depending upon what the need is, what the skill is, and so on. So the fluidity of it is a really critical piece.
And then in tier 2 is where we start to see that RTI model, or the response to intervention. So that screening that you're doing and progress monitoring alerts you to the changing needs of the students and lets you know, okay, should we keep doing what we're doing, or do we need to try something different? They need that more intensive one-on-one support to really understand this concept.
Right. And that's when we would go to tier 3. So tier 3 is getting even more intensive. My former principal used to say this was like the steroid shot. So we're going to just really intensify this, and we can intensify that by either the length of our session, the length of our intervention, the frequency of it. Are we seeing, if we were doing 3 days a week, let's see what happens when we do 5 days a week. Let's maybe go from our group of 5 to a group of 2. And so we're giving more opportunities to respond. And then my feedback is also going to intensify. Instead of just saying, hey, check that word, I'm going to say, this word is smiling. What's this word? Smiling. Let's read the sentence. So I'm giving them a little deeper corrective feedback as well. So I think about tier 2 is that, you know what, let's laser in. Let's see what we're doing. Let's see if we can give you a little cup of coffee and get you going here. Tier 3 is going to be even more strategic and intense for the student and also for the teacher. And so based on the response in tier 2, you're right, that's what tells me keep doing what you're doing, it's working, or it's not working at the rate I expected the response to happen, so I need to do some changing here. And that's when you move to tier 3.
Of course. And one thing that I think is important to acknowledge, maybe you feel differently, but having an EA support for a student does not equal tier 3 instruction. And that's where I'm seeing some issues where I see students that they have an EA or a part-time EA for whatever reason. They're saying, oh, well, they don't need that tier 3 instruction. Well, the EA isn't trained.
Right.
For most of them. I mean, there are the, occasional different EAs that have different backgrounds, but they aren't necessarily trained in that targeted science of reading or science of math, science of learning information to really help support this student to do better. They're there to provide the support to stay on task, to help with the behavior and other needs of the student, not be responsible for the instruction.
Yeah. And I think that's a myth or a misunderstanding of the role of the EA. Here we call them paraprofessionals, paras, that they are in place of the teacher's instruction. They might, I've heard teachers say, well, they're going to go out with a para and do this. And I think you have the para work with the kid that's on grade level or who needs some enrichment, and you go out and work with them. You give them that intensive intervention because you are certified. You are the one who's had the training. Or same thing with having parent volunteers. Your parents come in and they're like, I'm going to have them read with my low readers. What? Why? Why don't they read with the kids who don't need prompting and don't need corrective feedback? Let's switch that around. And
the ones that need to work on the prosody in their reading instead of the accuracy, right?
Right. And I think it comes from a place of extra manpower. I'll have them in my reading group. This will be an additional opportunity to practice. And I can see that, but when you think about, depending upon what skill they're practicing, if it's multiplication facts, absolutely, parent can help with that. But when we're giving instruction on a new skill to develop, that really needs to come from the teacher.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I don't know how it is where you are, but the muddy part of this is, okay, my students in tier 1, I'm teaching them, I've done some tier 2, they weren't making progress, I intensified it to do tier 3. What if they don't make progress? Does that mean they need a special education evaluation or what? And I think all things SPED tend to be gray because it is very individualized on what, and it needs to be individualized on what that particular kid needs. So while I wish I could give my teachers I support a checklist if you do these things, and that's when it's time to take them to the sit team to talk about whether this child needs a special education evaluation. But that's not the case. So I
Well, and
usually,
there's
yeah,
so many things that we need to consider also, like absenteeism, what's intrinsic to the child that can be affecting us.
yeah,
I remember the first time I heard about response to intervention and, MTSS model in my teacher education program. It horrified me.
why?
Because of, as an individual with dyslexia. Now, this was before I really understood it, right? So this is my
Okay.
initial reaction. And, I had a very long process to my diagnosis. And I didn't understand, and it wasn't really explained in this matter, where we have this progress monitoring, the screening, and having all this data follow the student across the grades. And I saw it as, okay, so each year we're going to start with a blank slate. Everybody's going to be in tier 1, and we're not going to get the support, and it's going to delay, okay, so we do tier 1 for, September, October, as we're just getting the student, used to the school or used to the teacher, the classroom, the routines. And then end of October, you get identified of, oh, okay, well, we need the tier 2. So we try the tier 2 for a while, and it doesn't have that progress monitoring element in it, or at least that wasn't explained to me at the time. And it, in a lot of places, it still doesn't. We don't have that screening component, and we don't have the progress monitoring to ensure that the student's in the right intervention. And then finally, at some point by the end of the year, last term, they might moved up to that tier 3, but they don't really have that good chunk of solid tier 3 instruction. And then, so when are we going to have the progression to say, okay, look, this student needs the psychoeducational assessment or the evaluation? And it wasn't, expressed that, okay, well, we're going to screen the kids at the beginning of the year and do that right away. And there are going to be students that we can identify in September as saying, look, we need to look further. We need to do that more diagnostic assessments right off the bat, especially when we look at what happened last year. So that was my concern, is having it more as a quicksand, slow going approach to getting the intervention the student needs. And also that trial time in the tier 1 and the tier 2, when the student clearly needs tier 3. And that's what I'm experiencing with the students that I work with here is, oh, well, they're getting tier 2. And if the parent happens to give them outside of school tutoring or support, then well, they get the tier 1 there. And the school kind of gives up that responsibility of the tier 1 and saying, okay, well, based on where this student is and where they need support, that tier 2 support you're providing with them is not useful. It's wasting their time and your time. They're better off in tier 1, not missing the core instruction.
Yeah.
They need that tier 3 instruction right away.
I totally agree. And I also think a thing that happens because of schedules, I always say special education schedule is a game of Tetris, because trying to get everybody in when they're not missing core and they're not missing recess and they're not missing, but when I can see it's a difficult thing, but when it becomes difficult, sometimes students end up getting pulled for special education services from the core, the tier 1. And what I don't think that they're not understanding that by missing that tier 1, you're actually putting that child further behind. Yeah. So maybe they can't read along with them, or maybe their math skills aren't quite at that level, but they still deserve that opportunity to hear it and see it. And it's the same type of thing when we have babies. We don't not talk to them until they can understand it. We talk to them even though they have no idea, all they hear is wah, 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 wah. But pretty soon they start to hear those words formed, and the speech sounds, and they tie those words with emotions. And that's how they learn language. And by taking kids out of tier 1, even though it seems like they, quote, may not be ready for it, we're taking the opportunity for them to start learning that away from them, which just makes that gap bigger. So that's another piece that I understand why sometimes that happens, because schedules are crazy. But it's as we are working in our district to really teach this MTSS framework and the thinking with that, we're also really trying to say we have to have a strong tier 1. We have to have all of our kids in tier 1, and then let's be strategic about the rest of it, and be fluid and know what our kids need. Have you ever heard of the DIKW pyramid?
It sounds
I
familiar.
heard it. Yeah, it may be. I heard it on a podcast in the framework of assessment. And as I was listening to it, it really made me think of instruction too. So basically, we use these 4 pieces to help us make decisions for instruction. So the first level would be data. So of course, we're using data to drive our instruction. Sometimes, we have to be very careful about collecting data that we can actually use, and not just being a data collector, but being a data user. If you're collecting data for the sake of collecting it, you're wasting time. So not only do we have to know what kind of data to collect, but we have to know what to do with it and how to interpret it. But data is definitely that piece. So I might look at my a school's universal screening results, and I see the numbers, and I see the increase or the decrease, and I see the growth rate, and I see all those pieces, but I don't know that kid because all I know is the data. So teachers use that next level of information. They use information about that student. So prime example, I flagged a student was flagged for literacy, that we needed to do some diagnostics. And the teacher said, yeah, so that day he cried. He was having a really rough day. Later on, we did the test. He's actually one of my best readers and spellers. And I don't see any concern with him because he's one of the leaders in my group. So I said, this is because I shared this pyramid with them too, because I said, I see the data. I don't know the information that you know about those students that can either validate or invalidate that data. So that's also a piece of information that teachers use to make decisions about maybe when to go to tier 2 or tier 3. Knowledge is the next piece. So teachers use their experience, their knowledge about standards, their knowledge about teaching and what works and what doesn't work, and the art of teaching and the science of teaching. So we use those pieces too, but the top piece of that is wisdom. And teachers, the wisdom is synthesizing all those things together to say, is this the best choice? Teachers will say to me, okay, I'm thinking this, can I do this or can I do this? And I said, what's your teacher wisdom say? You have all those pieces of that pyramid and I don't. So what's your wisdom say? And they're like, okay, I think this is the best way. And then I'm like, tell me about why. What did you use to get there? And they explain it. I'm like, see, your wisdom is spot on. Follow that. So being able to articulate that, and part of my job is to help them either believe in their wisdom or develop their wisdom. Because if they're using all those components, then they're probably going to make the best choice available at that time.
Yeah, and that's so important. And you need to be able and confident in trusting your instincts based on what you know about your student, because again, those one-off tests, there's so many other factors than what is being assessed in the moment.
And I was only add that with the science of reading, I guess, movement in our district, we just started science of reading curriculum and instruction last year. So this is year 2 for it, to have a systematic structured literacy approach in our district. So a lot of teachers don't feel like they have that knowledge yet. They're building that knowledge, which is part of my role to go into PLCs and share that knowledge to say, okay, you've got these things. Let me give you some insight about what the research says. Let me give you some insight as to other things I've seen with my experience, and help them to kind of get a bigger picture and fill in more of those puzzle pieces so that they can develop their own wisdom. But it's a learning process. And like we talked about last time, I think teacher capacity is a big variable in how productive and effective teachers are in applying that. And that's not a blaming statement at all. It's just reality that the needs of the demands on a teacher are so much greater than they used to be. That some teachers are like, I'm doing my best. I know I'm not doing it the way I should be, but here's what I am doing. And I hope that's enough. We'll get there, but
Definitely. I
process.
did want to bring up, I don't know if you listen to the Melissa and Lori podcast, but their 100th episode was featuring Dr. Stephen Dykstra, and he discussed trauma and reading. And I think that's a really important discussion to have. And he was bringing up how we need to have that in consideration when we're doing this. And again, that was some of my hesitation at first with the RTI MTSS model, is this kid is going to do it over and over again. And, knowing from personal experience, the trauma that can cause. And also highlighting that, yeah, you know what, maybe if you take them out of the social studies or the science for that tier 1, yes, they're going to miss the content, but they can catch up on that a lot faster than they can learning how to read, right? And getting those foundational skills. So yes, the Tetris is difficult for assigning times to work with students, but realize you don't want to take them out of their favorite subjects in order to focus on this area of weakness, because that's the one thing that they're looking forward to in the day.
Yep, for sure. We've even talked about that in middle school, where students may, 6th graders will get 2 electives to choose. And if they have needs for reading, we have a special reading class to help accelerate that. But perhaps they have resource, that's one of their electives. And then this reading class is the second. Well, if they're in band or strings, or they want to do theater or then they have to sacrifice that in order to get these. And so we have discussions as a team with parents to say, what do we think? What do we think? Is it worth it? Just some kids are like, I take lessons, I'm good. I want to get this done. And they're fine with resource and reading. Other kids, like you said, that's the part of the day that they are strong, they're leaders, they're confident. And so why would we take that, the SEL, the social emotional difficulties that could come from that may not be worth it. So then we have to rethink, okay, we're going to do resource or reading, or can we do reading and resource, or how can we make this work so they can still have that elective to be in their strong area.
Yeah, well, another thing that we have in Canada is typically in the 4th grade, students in the English stream will start an additional language, right? So it's typically French, but sometimes Mandarin or a First Nations language is available for them to take as a second language. And often with a diagnosis, they'll receive a language exemption. So they're able to get that resource support during the second language.
Yeah, that's very cool. I love that. I kind of wish America did that too. That really we would be learning not as an elective, but as a requirement. And I know a lot of European countries do that as well. But back to the trauma piece, not just with electives, but we've had some, especially our 4th and 5th graders in elementary, who have been in one of those tier 2 reading groups. They're making progress, but not enough to say, you're done, you graduated, let's get you, they have to continue that to continue to make progress. And a few of them at that point are really frustrated with having to always go to that group. And so our teams have talked about, maybe since our interventions are 3 weeks, maybe we take a 3-week cycle and put them in with a fluency group, or maybe we put them in with a language comprehension group. I'm not saying they don't need that phonics, but for their own self-worth and self-esteem, they get to go be in a group with what they see as the smart kids. Yes. And so it makes them feel less inadequate. And if we can, we try to rotate the teachers who work with those groups. So it's not like, oh, well, you're with Mrs. Blackwell, she always gets the dumb kids, so it's not that that stigma. We try to kind of mix that up so that it just feels like, who do I go to today? Or who do I go to for this cycle? For that exact reason, to think about their social emotional pieces too. So.
Well, and another thing that I think is often left out of the MTSS models is those students that are excelling and need the additional challenge. And, typically they're just assigned extra work.
Mhm.
And again, that's not, self-directed extra work. That's not going to help them excel or succeed and learn those skills that are maybe outside of the curriculum, but they're ready for, and taking that deeper dive.
And that's something that I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that a lot of my teams will talk to me about. They'll say, we have all these things in place for struggling learners, but by the time I do this MTSS group and this MTSS group and my core and my when do I get to work with my high kids? When do I get to work on enrichment? And we just finished our winter universal screening session, and we looked through some of the growth percentiles, and we noticed that there were some kids that had been flagged in the fall and flagged in the winter, but their growth percentile was like 95th. So they were making humongous gains. We were closing that gap. What we're doing is working. We're just not quite caught up yet. So what we're doing is working. Conversely, you've got those kids who were high performers in the fall, high performers in the winter. So looking at just that data, you go, cool, they're in the clear. And then you look at their growth percentile and it's in the 13th percentile. So yes, they're high, but I didn't push them in the way that they needed to be pushed. I didn't move them from one level to the next. And truly what it comes down to is not a lack of desire or motivation, it's time. So when do I pull? Because and this goes back to our whole assessment thing, like our, of course, I'm losing the word right now. Can't think of it. Anyway, we are judged on our test scores.
Yes.
And so if our low kids, if we don't teach them and get them caught up, then our scores are going to be low. Our accreditation. See, this is what happens when you get in your late 40s. You start to have menopause. But then that affects our accreditation and it affects our appraisals. And so that's why teachers put so much focus on them, and because they need to learn, that's our job. But the high flyers often get overlooked because their scores are helping us, and again, I don't put any of that on the teacher's lack of interest or desire or motivation to help them. It's a logistical thing.
Yeah, well, and it's also, we have the neurodiverse individuals that, have just the deficits, but there are the twice exceptional students that have the deficits and have the gift. And it's important that you're able to support both, right? Because if you forget one, it goes by the wayside and you're not going to have the same rate of improvement that's really going to help that child's self-esteem. And once they see that hard work can help them move forward and progress in something that they like doing or are good at, they're more likely to put that effort into something that's more difficult, and it can help you create that growth mindset for the student.
Yeah, definitely. With that, thinking about time with the teachers or the teacher's day, one of the things our district is really trying to shift our teachers to is integrating social studies and science with our ELA standards, so that you can teach a social studies lesson and hit a lot of those ELA standards at the same time. And so then that opens up a block of time in your day, instead of going, this hour is for reading, this hour is for math, this hour is for, if you can overlap those, even if a couple of days a week, that opens up a little window of time that could be used for those enrichments or those double deficit or a different small group to meet the needs. But
yeah, well, one thing
in practice
that I love doing is incorporating morphology into I'm not sure if you have this book. Unlocking Literacy
No.
by Marcia Hendry, but she has a whole appendix based on words commonly found in textbooks.
Okay.
And she breaks it down by subjects and looks at the morphology. And she has, the primary grades and the secondary grades, and using that to help them learn about morphology and structured word inquiry. Again, these are vocabulary words that you're already going to have to teach them. So why not give them the strategies they can do? And another thing that I love throwing into lessons at that tier 1 is those little tidbits that, some of your students are not going to understand, but it's not essential for them to getting anything from the lesson. But those high flyers that understand more about orthography and morphology can pick that up. And it's funny how it clicks. One that I always use, my typical example. So if you've listened to my podcast, you've probably heard it before, but recognizing that the PH representation of the phoneme is found in words that have that Greek origin and that the etymology from the Greek, because the Greek alphabet did not have the letter F. So understanding that, and even like your lower kids, younger students may not get it, but the high flyers in that classroom, because you threw in that 15-second tidbit, are going to have that deeper understanding. And it's working on your craft and your own personal background knowledge.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things you said in that was putting that into tier 1. And so we can enrich our kids in tier 1 while also starting to raise the inquiry level of our kids who may have struggled. I have one of the 5th grade teachers I support is just gifted. She's this is her second career. She's been teaching for 4 years, and I walk into her lessons and I'm just blown away at how she's so effortlessly, seemingly, weaves together so many components of language just in her regular talk. Like they did a reader's theater, and so I came to watch it, and she was talking to her class as they were sitting down, and she said, class, the most egregious thing you could do, which means like the worst thing you could do, is to talk while somebody else is performing. And I thought, oh my gosh, egregious is not a 5th grade word, but look at how she just threw that in there. And then she defined it in a kid-friendly term so that they could start to be aware of that. And the higher kids, I'm sure, like, oh, that was awesome. Way to go, Miss Skill. But the lower kids may have gone, the what? But then just like I was talking about with babies, we don't wait until they can understand before we start talking to them. So if we weave in little tidbits of this or that about etymology, about math, about history, about orthography, whatever it is, vocabulary, into our tier 1, we're raising the level of the cognition in our room.
And one of the best ways that we can do that, in my opinion, is being conscious about our vocabulary and using it and giving them the understanding. Like, as I've said before, that my children are in French immersion from kindergarten. So they are rapidly expanding their vocabularies, and they have to, because they're hearing this language and they're learning the new words. But, think of what you could do in an English stream, just incorporating those words. And something that really hit me was with my youngest. We had moved to a new house, and in the garden, I was talking about the different types of flowers in the garden. And one day she took out her grandfather out to the garden and said, "Granddad, this is my favorite flower. It's a hydrangea." And she had just turned 3. And I can guarantee you at 3 years old, I did not know that word, but she could identify it correctly. She knew what it was just because she was hearing it and absorbing it. And especially in those early years of schools, the primary years, that's when the brain's designed and built to naturally get the vocabulary. So while they're not learning how to read naturally, they're getting that vocabulary embedded in the
Yeah.
classroom.
And that was illustrated to me when I was reading as an adult. I was just reading a novel
Mhm.
and I saw the word ornery. Well,
Mhm.
around here we say ornery.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so ornery. And so I had always thought, and I had never seen it, I had just heard it.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, it's probably spelled like honor with a
Yeah.
Y, ornery, or maybe ERY or something.
Yeah.
So then I see it in text and it says ornery, and I thought, oh my gosh, oh my goodness. And I started making that connection from, I knew what it meant, I knew the
Yeah.
word, but I had not linked it to the text yet. But because I had the vocabulary, I was able to make that link with the orthography too, which when your daughter gets into where she's reading the word hydrangea, she'll be like, oh yeah, I know that's that flower in my
And
garden. I
that's
love
going to
it.
facilitate that orthographic mapping, right? Because it has that 3 components, having
Yeah,
the vocabulary, the pronunciation, and the spelling.
yeah. And I think our conversation about tier one really feels or goes well with MTSS, because if we have a really rich and efficient tier one, the odds of needing tier two and tier three are less and less.
Mhm.
So, like I said, we just finished our winter round of our universal screener, and some of the data isn't showing humongous growth in our intervention kids that we've been working with. And so initially it was like, what's going wrong? What do we need? What do we need to shift? Is it fidelity of the intervention? And then I thought, we need to check tier one first.
Mhm.
Before we start messing with tier two and tier threes, let's make sure our tier one is as strong as it can be. It's still a new curriculum. Perhaps certain teachers are still getting acquainted with it, and so we aren't seeing the results in student growth yet. But that's where I can come in, or an administrator can come in and say, hey, let's work on this, or let's look at that, not in those terms, but to really check to make sure that tier one, that foundational instruction is rich and strong. And as they say, because it used to be a really like, oh, catchphrase, oh my gosh, I've never heard that. And now everybody says, can't tier two your way out of a bad tier one. But it's so true. So I think when teachers are thinking about MTSS and the framework, we also need to think about, it's not just the interventions or the enrichments, it's the tier one. So are we being as effective as we can be with that? If we are, can we make it any better? If we have room to grow, where do we need to grow? Where do we need to put the focus?
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a nice natural lead to our next conversation about implementation science. And it doesn't just apply to the tier two and tier three. Has, how you just mentioned, looking back at that tier one and seeing if the instruction that we're using for whole class is really working.
Yeah. And, I think too, as we get into our next talk, that there's some different lenses, like implementation at the district level, at the school level, at the class level, at the intervention level. Some of those things, there's a consistent thread throughout those, but the obstacles, the variables, the considerations are different at each of those levels. And when I was in my doctorate program taking this course about it, that was insightful to me, because I started thinking, okay, we have to think about things in a different way, and how we can implement for efficacy in our system, efficacy with our instruction, efficacy with our students.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be a good conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
So I guess to kind of summarize our conversation, how have you seen the implementation of the MTSS model change over the years? And do you think we're getting better at using it effectively in our practice?
I haven't studied other districts' process and progress, but I can tell you from our district, we're a substantial size. We have, I've mentioned 36 elementaries, 10 middle schools, and 5 high schools. So we're a pretty substantial district. When MTSS first came out, that we started talking about it in the earlier 2000s, it was very much a checklist, and it was not successful. It was not, kids would not make progress in that intervention. teachers looked at it like, this is a hoop I have to jump through in order to get them to evaluate for special education. We didn't use the progress monitoring. We didn't have adjustments made from after one intervention. Of course, we didn't progress monitor, so we didn't know if it was working or not. But teachers didn't see any carryover. So it was just something else to do. It was what you did during your small group time. So that's kind of where we came from, and it left a really sour taste in educators' mouths because it just felt like a checkbox. Last year and this year, as our district has moved towards really looking at the framework of it, universal screening, progress monitoring, data-driven groups, professional learning community conversations where we're going through and interpreting data to make decisions about what student needs what, both in math and in literacy. We have that for both those subjects. The conversations that teachers are having are 10 times better, different than they were. I remember at the beginning of last year coming in, talking with them, meeting them, building relationships, whatever, talking about this process, and they were just like, oh my God, I can't. Okay, now what? And then the beginning of this year, sitting in those same PLCs and hearing them talk about this piece of data and that piece of data, and well, they did this, but they didn't do that, so I think I need to do X, Y, Z. And I just sat there and smiled, and somebody looked over at me and they're like, why are you smiling? I was like, I'm actually misty-eyed, and I'm smiling because the progress and the depth of your conversation has changed so much in just a year's time. I said, what's your confidence level like? And they're like, it's much better. Last year at this time, we wanted to say, we're going to say hard pass because it was too much. But the level of conversation and understanding that I'm hearing teachers have with not just the process or even the product of the intervention, but the decisions of what they're going to do and how they're going to change it. And if they don't know what to do, then they reach out and they say, here's what's happening. Here's where I'm going to go. What do you think? And that shift is huge. So I think we're doing it right. As right as we've ever done it. There's still room for improvement, especially as we go from that. We've been in tier 3 now. Do we go to SPED or do we change? Or that transition definitely needs some more attention. But overall, I'm really proud of our educators and the shifts they've made and the quick progress that they've made.
Wonderful. It's so encouraging to hear stories like that and recognizing that it is a process. It's not just turning on a light switch and having it work perfectly. And I feel like your district is so lucky to have someone like you help facilitate that transition.
Well, thank you. It's actually my pleasure. It's my privilege to get to be a part of this and watch them grow and not need me anymore. I mean, there are times I sit in PLCs, I'm like, you don't need me anymore. They're like, we do need you, but they, to see them making that growth is what fills my bucket. That's what drives me. So it's pretty awesome to get to be in that role.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Blackwell. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, we'll have a good talk about implementation science next.